This meeting is being recorded.
And Tim, you might want to just keep an eye on that waiting room while I do the introductions, because I think we might have a few folks join a little late.
Okay.
I am going to go ahead and get started. Admit this last person. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I am pleased to be hosting this presentation on two different projects that conducted habitat assessments and salmon life cycle modeling in both the Snohomish and the Stillaguamish basins. And so just for your information, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available for those who are interested in viewing it at a later time. And for our presentation today, we do have just an hour. So we'll have a presentation first, followed by time for questions and discussion. And in order to stay on track, we will be saving our questions for the end of the presentation. That being said, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat and we can return to those once we get to the end of the presentation. So for those I haven't met yet, my name is Elizabeth Spalding, and I am an implementation strategy lead with the National Estuary Program's Habitat Strategic Initiative. And our program is an interagency team with both Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Washington Department of Natural Resources. And we are focused on advancing Puget Sound recovery through both collaborative planning as well as strategic investments. And through a cooperative agreement with the EPA, we award NEP geographic program funding in support of the Puget Sound Action Agenda, as well as our implementation strategies. So these grants support traditionally difficult to fund actions that catalyze greater opportunities for future recovery progress in Puget Sound. And Tim, if you could go to the next slide, please. So this webinar will highlight two projects, both led by Tim Beachy at NOAA, that use the habitat assessment and restoration planning model developed by Tim to help identify habitat restoration actions that have the greatest potential to increase spawner abundance of Chinook salmon, coho salmon, and steelhead in the Stillaguamish and Snohomish watersheds. So both of these projects were selected by the Habitat Strategic Initiatives Advisory Team because of their alignment with our investment plans monitoring and information gaps funding theme, as well as their strong connections to our floodplains and estuaries implementation strategy. And so these projects both advance the river basin scale integrated planning and project implementation sub-strategy, which identifies as a critical need the identification and prioritization of reach scale restoration and protection projects. And if you have questions about our program or this specific implementation strategy, please do feel free to reach out to us after this webinar. And then Tim, if you want to go to the next slide. So our presenter today, Tim Beachy, is a research geomorphologist and ecologist in the watershed program at NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. His current research interests include influences of valley and river channel morphology on salmon habitats and populations, developing process-based restoration strategies, and guidance for adapting river restoration plans for climate change. Tim's recent work has focused on development of the habitat assessment and restoration planning model, which you'll hear more about today, which is a process-based habitat change assessment and salmon life cycle modeling process for comparing the potential effectiveness of habitat restoration alternatives. Tim holds a bachelor's degree in geology, a master's degree in fisheries, and a PhD in forest hydrology, all from the University of Washington. And we are very excited to have him here today. And so Tim, I will hand it over to you now.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to turn my video off just because my computer is a little bit slow anyway, it seems like today. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to try to go through these slides in about 45 minutes and then hopefully leave enough time for questions. So the sort of the work team is on the bottom there. Ariana, Britta, Alexander, or Alex, Michaela, Amy, Jeff, and Peter have all contributed a lot to this project. So I just want to make sure to acknowledge them before we go forward. Let's see, it is not advancing. I'd have to do that manually. Okay, so the overview for today. So I'm just going to do quickly what the purpose of the model is and a general description of it. I'm going to keep the description and methods very simple because there's enough results to go over that I think it's better to focus on those. So then I'll start with the habitat assessment results, and then I'll give a brief description of each of the life cycle models. for coho, steelhead, and Chinook, and then we'll go into the life cycle model results. There we go. Now it's working. So the purpose for this particular project, the first task was to develop the life cycle models for Chinook, coho, and steelhead under current habitat conditions. And we do that so that we can compare the outputs of the model to observed run sizes and things like that. So we have a good idea that the model is working the way we think it should. And then we quantify the historical habitat conditions for the diagnostic scenarios, which are scenarios that we run to evaluate the restoration potential for each different kind of action that we have in the model. And I'll go through those next, what those actions are. And then finally, we run those diagnostic scenarios to help prioritize the restoration actions for each basin and for each species. So the scenarios that we run right now are these. I believe there's 8 of them now total. So there's the barrier one, which is where we take out all the migration barriers and leave everything else at the historical condition, and we see how much difference that makes in the population. So we turn these on one at a time, and then we set everything back to current conditions. So for the second one, we'd set everything to current except for historical fine sediment and see how much difference that makes. And then we go through wood and shade and channel length and bank condition, beaver ponds, floodplain, and estuary. So each one of those gets run one at a time. And then we'll show some bar charts at the end that just compares the restoration potential for each action for each species. So that's what the diagnostic scenarios are. This is what the model looks like. Across the top, we have the potential restoration actions in the orange and the other external drivers, which are impervious surface area and roads, which currently affects pre-spawn survival for coho salmon. And then we have these climate variables, which are not part of this project. They will be part of the next phase of the Stillaguamish project. So those can also be run in the model. But these are the actions that I just listed in the diagnostic scenarios, except the estuary one is not in this diagram. So we've added that since I did this diagram before. So each arrow is a function in the model. So for example, if we take out barriers, that affects spawning area and it affects rearing area. It doesn't affect the habitat type or the cover type or any of these other variables. If we look at something like shade, that affects temperature, and that's all. So it's affecting a quality variable, which is these light blues, and the dark blues are the area variables. And then from this second row, once we've quantified all of these habitats in the basin, then we have to translate those into a life cycle model input. So spawning area affects spawning capacity, rearing area affects rearing capacity, and then the habitat types affect capacities and productivities. The cover types affect productivities mainly, and a little bit of capacity for Chinook. So that's just some examples of what these different linkages are that are built into the model. And then once we have these input parameters for the life cycle model, we run it through the life cycle model and we get population abundance and productivity at a sub-basin scale and at the basin scale. So that's what the model looks like. For the habitat assessment, what we do is go through for each of these are basically the diagnostic scenarios and an external driver. We go through and estimate current and historical conditions for each of those potential actions or potential habitat issues that we want to address. So we have migration barriers, fine sediment, wood, shade, etc. So these are all the same ones that were listed as diagnostic scenarios, except this one's been added, impervious area and roads. So just to go through a few of the results then. So for migration barriers, this is the percentage of habitat in each basin for each species that's above some kind of barrier. That barrier doesn't have to be fully blocking, but it does have to be a migration barrier of some type. So you can see that for coho and for the winter run steelhead, they're pretty similar. We've got around 20% above some kind of barrier for coho salmon, and 10 to 13% for winter run steelhead, and then lower numbers for summer and fall run Chinook and summer run steelhead. And these are in a little bit larger systems, and so there's fewer barriers in those areas, whereas something like coho salmon tends to be really concentrated in the small streams for spawning, so they have a much higher percentage of their spawning habitat area affected by these barriers. So again, that is if they were, they don't all have to be fully blocking. So if we ran the model with 20% barriers and they were all 100% blocking, we'd probably see about a 20% change in the population. But because they're not all 100% blocking, the response is lower than that. So this is what the data look like after we've processed it. So this map, just to orient you, here's the North Fork Stillaguamish, South Fork Stillaguamish, and main stem. Then we have Pilchuck River, Snohomish River, Snoqualmie River, and then the main stem Snohomish. And this map shows the passability ratings for each reach in the basin as a function of those barriers. So we don't have the barriers shown on here, but as you might guess, where you go from a dark blue to any other color, that means there's a barrier of some type blocking some portion of the passage. The way we use this in the model is if the rating, for example, is 0.33, we reduce the capacity to a third of what it was. This means a third of the fish can get through. If it's 0.66, it means 2/3 can get through. And then the barrier passage ratings are cumulative. So if you have two in a row, they're multiplied by each other. So you can get really low cumulative passage ratings very quickly. And so you see a lot of these dark red areas, where we have a little bit of urbanization. That's where these tend to occur the most. Or in ag land sometimes. And they're mostly in the lowlands. Once you get into the upper basin, for any of these, there's not as many barriers over fish habitat anyway. There may be some that are above the anadromous zone, so there's not as much habitat blockage up there. So this map is one of the inputs that helps us determine what the spawning capacity or the egg capacity is for each species in each basin. Fine sediment data, in this particular case, we found quite a bit of fine sediment data, and after a lot of trial and error, we ended up with 4 different sediment models because there was no one model that could cover all of these different situations. So we first had the model for less than 30-meter bankful width, and that's the only one that's sensitive to land use. So that one can change from historical to current conditions. The other ones, the 30 to 60 meter, there was no statistical relationship to any land use variable, so it doesn't change when we go to historical. And then the greater than 60 meter bankful width, we only had one really good data set. And in that data set, which was for the Stillaguamish from the north-south fork confluence all the way to the confluence with the Snoqualmie. That one didn't show any linear trend at all. It was basically, it was bumpy, but it was the same, essentially the same all the way through. So for those, there's just an averaged variable that gets applied to those river systems, except for the Snoqualmie, which is very unique. And we found a good data set from one of Derek Booth's old reports from King County and managed to reconstruct some fine sediment levels for that. And I won't go into the details of it just because it takes a little while to explain, but you can see it's kind of patchy. It has stretches of very low fine sediment and then stretches of very high fine sediment. So it has its own model. Here's another example looking at the capacity change from loss of wood. So spawning, this is for coho salmon, spawning on the right, summer in the middle, and winter rearing capacity. Spawning on the left, sorry, I think I said right. Summer capacity in the middle and winter on the right. And these are just in fish per kilometer. So this is for the spawning capacity, it's number of adults change. And for summer and winter rearing capacity, it's number of juveniles per kilometer change. And you can see that that's much more of a capacity change in this model for the rearing capacities than it is for the spawning capacity. And that's largely because in the large rivers, the wood does not have as much effect on spawning gravel quantity as it does on rearing potential. Then loss of shade. So we have, this is the canopy opening angle. So just to orient you to what that is, the canopy opening angle is if you're standing in the middle of the stream and you have a line of sight to the top of the tree on the left bank and the top of the tree on the right bank, the angle that those two lines of sight form is called the canopy opening angle. So it's the amount of sky that you can see. So if it's 0, it means you can't see anything. If it's 180, that means it's completely open. There's nothing on either side of you. And so this is the pattern of change in both basins. It's pretty similar in each. And the main things that we see are at the tails. So on the low end, the ones that had very closed canopy, so less than 10 degrees of opening, so almost closed canopy, those dropped by a significant amount in both basins. So historically, the dark blue bar, there was close to 50% in each basin. Now it's more like 33, 35% in each basin that's closed canopy or near to it. The other end, it's the opposite, where we went from very low proportion of reaches that had a wide canopy opening angle to a fairly high proportion. So more than doubling, almost tripling in both cases, for these wide open ones. So these places are where we would expect to see a lot of temperature change, where a reach like this is getting shifted to a reach like that. And this happens fairly frequently in agricultural and rural lands. So then we use that canopy opening angle to modify temperature, but first we have to come up with a current temperature. And so this is using as many data points as we could find. And so the dots on these maps are the original, excuse me, the original temperature measurement points. And this map is showing the current 7-day average daily maximum for each one, and then the model in the reaches. So all the lines are the modeled values and the points are the original data values. And so the model is a statistical spatial network model, much like Dan Isaac used to create the Norwest um, temperature map. So it's the same kind of analysis, but applied at a much smaller scale with a high density of points. So the accuracy is better for this particular site compared to that model, because they were modeling very large regions. Pretty much most of Western Washington was a single region for them, and we're just modeling these two subbasins. And you can see just a couple of highlights. One, that the warmest parts are in the lower Stillaguamish, and then a little bit in the lower Snohomish, but really this part stands out as being a very high temperature zone. And then up in the headwaters, there's a few places where it's still relatively cool, but you have to get pretty high up and into the trees before there's a lot of water that's less than about 15 degrees. Most of it's higher than that, pretty much everywhere. And so this is the change. So once we have that current one, we can go back and use, instead of the current canopy opening angles, we use the historical canopy opening angles. And there's a function in the model that translates the change in canopy opening angle to a change in temperature in degrees Celsius. So when we go from historical to current, what you notice is that, as you might expect from that bar chart, a lot of reaches don't really change much. And that's because, especially the reaches in forest lands, have pretty good riparian protections. And so the shade values there are not that different from what they were historically. So we don't get much temperature change. And the dark blue in this map is 0 to 2 degree change. So it can still be significant, but it's relatively smaller. These ones that are between 2 and 6 degrees, the light blue and the purple, is pretty much all of these small streams down in this area. So where we have the development, that's where we have the larger changes in canopy opening angle, and that's what creates the largest changes in temperature. And you can see there's a few spots where we're getting about a 6-degree change from the historical to the current condition. And that's almost always in small streams where we've gone from pretty much closed canopy historically to almost completely open currently. If we go from 0 to 180 degrees, the model predicts just slightly over 6 degrees as the change in temperature. So that's pretty much the maximum that you can get, is right around 6. There's a few values that are slightly over it, but there isn't anything that really hits 8. Then beaver ponds. We're also looking at the change in beaver pond area from current conditions to historical. And the main value that changes is the density of beaver dams. And so we keep the size of the dams constant. We're assuming that they're not really building larger dams historically or smaller. We don't know which it would be. So we have an empirical data set for current dams and pond sizes, and we take the median value of that and use that pond size just for the modeling. So we model the current beaver dam density as 0.32 dams per kilometer in this case, and then the historical beaver dam density is 6 per kilometer. So it's a pretty big change going from historical to current. And then we only apply that where there is beaver intrinsic potential. So this map is showing the beaver intrinsic potential from 2 different models. Pollock et al. 2004 was a simple stream power model that was created for the Stillaguamish River Basin, and then the Dip-Brenner model was created in the Skycomish and Snohomish River Basins. And that one is more of it's a more traditional intrinsic potential model where it has several criteria that are scored, and you add up the scores, and that gives you a high, medium, low potential. In the model right now, the way we're running it, the Ditbrenner model is the default. It can also be run with the Pollock model, but we're running the Ditbrenner model right now. And that means that in this map, all the dark blue and yellow reaches are the ones that have beaver potential. The pink ones don't, and the grayed out reaches don't have potential under either model. So every reach that has a blue or a yellow color here is going to get modeled as having a current beaver dam density of 0.232 per kilometer and a historical density of 6 per kilometer. The only other beaver dams or beaver ponds in the model are those that were mapped in floodplains, either in the NHD plus data set or in the historical data set from the General Land Office surveys. So there are other ponds around the large rivers, but they have to have been mapped or digitized. For floodplain habitat change, it's been a pretty big loss of marsh habitat in both basins proportionally. It's around 75, 80% loss, maybe even a little more in both basins. We went from only about 800 hectares in the Stillaguamish, and it was 4,000 and some in the Snohomish. So much larger floodplain and a lot more marsh in the Snohomish Basin than in the Stillaguamish. But similar degree of impact in both data sets. So big loss of marsh, somewhat of a loss in ponds, and either a small loss or a small increase in lakes. And the lakes are usually artificial impoundments of some type when there's an increase like this one. And these are just to note where these come from. So these blue bars are primarily from the General Land Office surveys that were back in the late 1800s. So those were mapped by Brian Collins and Amir Sheikh in a project that they did about 15 years ago now, maybe even more than that. It's a fairly old report, but the data sets are still solid. They're really nice maps of what the historical marsh polygons were, like where they were and how big they were in both basins. And so we use these data to help us identify what was there historically. And then currently, this pretty much all comes from the NHD Plus data set, which does a pretty good job of digitizing all of the ponds and marshes and lakes that were recognized from aerial imagery. This is what it looks like spatially. So it's the same kind of thing. There's a couple examples here. So the blue polygons here and here are lakes in the current condition. These yellow ones are marshes in the current condition. And when we say marsh versus pond, we're basically saying that marshes, they tend to be dry in the summer and wet in the winter. Ponds tend to be wet year round. Marshes typically in aerial imagery are heavily vegetated. So you don't see much open water in the marsh, but you see all open water in a pond. So these yellow ones mean there's polygons here that are wet for some portion of the year, and the wetland vegetation is what we see in the imagery for the most part. And then if we look at that same area historically, you see that some of these areas that were mapped as mapped as marshes now were mapped as ponds historically, so more open, less vegetation filled. And then at the edges of the valley is where the true marsh polygons were in the historical condition. And you can see that they're mostly concentrated where you would expect. The Snoqualmie Valley has a lot of them, sort of the Cherry Creek area, French Creek area, and then the lower Stillaguamish, especially this island crossing area, was a real high density of marshes and side channels and oxbows and things like that. Another aspect of the floodplain habitat change is the side channel habitat. So those maps that we're using do not have side channels in them. They're really only showing us the large polygons, things that can be seen easily on aerial imagery or that were large enough to map in the General Land Office surveys. And so we go through and map, either map ourselves from aerial imagery or use field data to map the length of side channel and the amount of side channel habitat that's out there currently. And then we use historical reference data from a study that we did in Puget Sound about almost 20 years ago now, or in Western Washington. It was sort of scattered across Western Washington, where we found minimally disturbed floodplain sites of different channel types and quantified the amount of floodplain habitat and the amount of side channel length that was in each one. And we use those reference data to help us identify for each reach in in these two basins what we think their historical side channel potential was. So there's not good maps of that. So we can't just, there's a few that were mapped historically in the general land office surveys, but they weren't very consistent on the side channel mapping. So what we do is use these reference site data to estimate how much more side channel habitat was there historically than there is now. And basically the way it works is that one channel type in particular tends to have a lot of side channel, and that's island braided channels, which in these two basins are concentrated mainly in the Snohomish and both forks of the Stillaguamish Basin. And then the lower basins and the Snoqualmie tend to be more sediment filled basins where they tend to have fewer side channels but more marshes. There are still side channels there. It's just not the really high density of side channels that we see in the incising reaches that are in the Snohomish and the Stillaguamish. So this is an example here in this area where most of them used to exist for the Stillaguamish. We've lost 70% in the lower main stem and the North Fork. So that's where most of the side channel potential was. So we went in this area alone from about 125 kilometers of side channel length down to 37. So that's a big loss. Overall, in the rest of the basin, including the rest of the basin, it was a 59% decrease in side channel habitat length for the Stillaguamish Basin. For the Snohomish, it was mostly in the Snohomish and in the middle Pilchuck River. And here we went from a little over 210 kilometers down to 80. So about a 62% loss in those four reaches. And then overall a loss of about 63%. So percentage wise, it's pretty consistent across the basin, but the other places were just going from, a smaller historical length to a very small current length. And then impervious surface area, I think this is the last habitat piece. So we used the data from Blake Feist, who's been working on this issue with a large group of people here at the Science Center for quite a while, probably almost 2 decades now. And what they did in Blake's 2017 paper was go through all of Puget Sound and map for each subbasin what their estimated pre-spawn mortality was based on a model that they built that uses the influence of both impervious surface area and road density to calculate an estimated pre-spawn mortality. So we take those pre-spawn mortalities directly from his data set, which is a geospatial data set, so we can apply it directly to each reach in the basin. So any reach that has a really dark red, like you see around in here, or in the Marysville area here, these tend to be the more heavily urbanized areas, and they have estimated pre-spawn mortality of 30 to 40%. So the highest one here was almost 40% for the pre-spawn mortality. And then you can see as you get out into the more wooded areas and even more rural areas that they tend to be very low. So we might just have less than 10% pre-spawn mortality. And then estuary habitat change. This is the map of the Stillaguamish. Current habitat here on the left, historical habitat on the right. These marsh polygons are just all the marsh types lumped together. So in the Collins and Sheik report from 2003, they mapped, the salt marsh fringe or the estuarine emergent marsh, I think is what they called it. And then there was a forested riverine tidal. Everybody uses different names for these. I forget exactly what theirs was. And then the farther up you get, the more you get to forested floodplain. So if we get outside of this polygon, which is the Delta polygon, and up in here, there's not as much wetland anymore. And it's mostly forested floodplain in the historical condition. You can see that a lot of that has been lost, and some of these areas have been reconnected already. So some of this green here is from restoration work in the past few years, or maybe past decade and a half. And then some of it probably was never degraded, but some of it has already been restored. So we're making progress on these already. And so when we're estimating current to historical now, we're using a current polygon that includes what's been restored up to the latest imagery that we used. Overall, one thing to note about this delta is that it's quite small, even historically. So even though it's been a large percentage loss, when you and you'll see this later when we run the model with even the full historical delta in there, it's not as impactful as a very large delta like the Snohomish, just because there is not as much rearing area here. I don't have a map that compares the two, but we can talk about that at the end if people have questions. So the Snohomish, much larger estuary. And again, a lot of this that is currently green is connected. This is well, relatively new or recently reconnected Quilute piece here. I don't remember the names of all of these other ones, but some of these are dike breaches as well. So there's parts of this that include restoration. And again, we're including all of those restored habitats as part of the current condition. And then the historical just estimates everything else that was out there. So one thing to note about these maps is these are just showing as an illustration the marsh habitat change. These channels are tidal channels and distributaries that were mapped in the GLO surveys. So this is a much lower density than what's actually out there, both currently and historically. So for each of these marsh polygons, we use Greg Hood's allometry equations that were developed in the Skagit and other places to estimate how much blind tidal channel habitat would have been in each of these marsh areas. For the most part, the distributaries haven't changed a lot. And where they have, the maps are pretty good at picking up that change. So the distributaries are fairly straightforward. We don't need to model anything there. We can just use what's mapped both currently and historically. But these marshes, we have to use a model to estimate how much tidal channel was out there. So that's it for the habitat data. So for the life cycle models, do a time check. Yeah, I think we're good. So these are the life cycle model structures. Coho salmon is the simplest one. We'll start with eggs or spawners. So we have spawners coming in, and then we have eggs in the gravel. Then we have an incubation productivity, which is affected by fine sediment and peak flows. And then we get emergent fry. And then we have the fry colonization. Some move down to the main stem, some stay in their natal basin. And then they go through summer rearing in their respective locations. And then there's another movement of a portion of them at the beginning of fall. And then they go through their winter rearing. And then we have smolts either coming from the main stem rearing areas or the natal basin areas. And then we go through the estuary with a density independent productivity or survival number there. And then we go through the ocean years. And then the model can run harvest. It's always been run with harvest off at this point. And then we have a pre-spawn mortality that can be applied. And that can either be a fixed number as we have for some species, or it can be affected by temperature or by the road density in urban areas as it is with coho. Then for Chinook salmon, it's quite a bit more complicated. We have adults of many more age classes coming back, and we have eggs in the gravel. We have the same incubation productivity, and then we have fry colonization right after they emerge. But in this case, there's a few that stay to be sub-yearlings and determined by the capacity. So once the capacity is filled by those that are going to stay as sub-yearlings, the rest of the fish leave as fry migrants. And so the fry migrants have to either spend a little bit of time rearing in the estuary to get bigger, or they go straight through to the near shore when there's not enough room in the estuary. And they have a very low survival compared to either the estuary rearing fry or either of the par migrants, which could be estuary rearing par or nearshore rearing par. But all of these three groups are relatively larger because they've had time to grow either in the freshwater or in the estuary. So they have a relatively higher SAR all the way to adult return, whereas this group is very low. And then mainly in the Snohomish, it's also turned on in the Chinook. Some proportion of them return as yearlings. So they go out as yearlings, and then they have a higher SAR still, and then they return to be adults. The percentage of adult returners in the Stillaguamish that went out as age ones is around 1% or less. So it's really insignificant in the model, but since it's part of the model, it's still turned on. It's a much higher percentage. I don't remember the exact percentages, but it's more like between 10 and 30%, depending on the year in the Snohomish and or Snoqualmie and Skykomish basins. And then once they're in the ocean, because this has the more complex age structure, so they don't all return at the same age. So the ones that go out as zeros, that's the first number here, is their freshwater age. And then they're in saltwater for a year. None of those return. They spend that year in saltwater. And then the ones that have 2 years in saltwater, some of those return. And then 3 years, more of those return. And then 4 years, that's the highest percentage, the 0-4s from this age group. And then the 5s, once they get to 0.5, we don't get any older than that. So all of those return. And then the same thing for these, except they have their age 1 going out. And none of the 2-year-olds return, but then we get some 3-year-olds return, and then 4s and 5s from that group. So much more complicated age structure in the Chinook salmon than in the coho salmon. And then same with steelhead, it's a different kind of complexity. It's more in the juvenile ages. So we start with eggs, and then we have emergent fry in the first summer and first winter rearing. And some of the age 1 par go out as smolts. It's a fairly low percentage of these in the adult return. I think it's around 10% in both basins. Most of them stay for a second year, and then this is the largest group, the age 2 group. So the ones that leave as 2-year-old freshwater age, that's the largest percentage of all of these fish. And then they start coming back after 1 year in the ocean, or 2 or 3 years in the ocean. And then a very small percentage stay to be age 3, and then they come back as either 4 or 5-year-olds as well. Oh, and this is the only one that has respawners. So there's a kelp respawner part of the model that has a certain proportion of the spawners return to the ocean, and they have their own survival rate, and then they come back to spawn again. So those are what the life cycle models look like. So each of those stages that you see in those models are, in this case, a row in an input table. So I'm just going to try to give you an illustration of what the data that come out of the model, out of the habitat analysis look like and how they fit into the life cycle model. So we have the pre-spawn productivity that we talked about, the adult and egg capacity, incubation productivity, and then summer rearing and winter rearing parameters. And so for each subbasin, which would be the columns, we have to calculate what's the pre-spawn productivity. So in this case, this is an old Chehalis example. So this would be for, I think this was for, I don't remember which species this was. I think it was coho. So we had a pre-spawn productivity that was affected by road density in that case. So each one is slightly different. They're fairly high there, except for this one. There's not a lot of urban area down there, so we didn't get really high impacts on the pre-spawn productivity from the road density for coho. But then we have a certain number of reds that can fit into the available spawning gravel. And that gets translated into an egg capacity by the fecundity. So it's basically the number of reds times the fecundity gets you the egg capacity. And then we have the incubation productivity, which again is affected by fine sediment. And in this case, peak flow would be the other one. And then summer capacity, summer productivity, winter capacity, winter productivity. And some of these, like the summer capacity, are affected by a large number of parameters. And I'll show you a table of that in a second. So what we're doing here, after we've completed all the habitat analysis, is we have to take each reach, each 200-meter reach has to get these parameters, and then they get rolled up to a subbasin so that we can calculate what the subbasin or subpopulation parameter is to run the life cycle model. So these are the effects. As I said, some of them, like summer and winter rearing, are affected by a lot of things. So they can be affected by barriers, wood loading, shade, channel length, bank condition, beaver pond area, floodplain habitat. All of those affect these rearing areas. Whereas something like egg to fry productivity in this case, in this particular diagram, is only showing the fine sediment effect. There's no peak flow on this list, but that also affects it when we run the dynamic model. So you can see that it's pretty complex, I guess you would say, in terms of the number of habitat factors that affect each of those parameters I just showed in the table before. And then similar for spring and fall Chinook, just a different set of life stages across the top, very similar at the beginning, but then sub-yearling rearing capacity and productivity, and then the yearling summer and winter rearing capacities. So more life stages here, but again, very similar in the number and types of parameters that are affected by each of these habitat factors. So to calculate the subbasin capacity, as I mentioned, we need to roll that up to a subbasin level. So for each reach, we have an area of a habitat type multiplied by the density of fish in that habitat type. So if we were calculating summer rearing area, for example, we'd have the area of each pool, and we add up all those pools in all reaches to say there's a total area of pools for the subbasin multiplied by the density of fish in the in that habitat type. And then we go to the next habitat type. So we add up all the riffle areas for the subbasin, multiply by their density, then all the pond areas multiplied by their density. We just go through all of the habitat types for whichever species we're working on. You add them all up, and that gives you your subbasin capacity for each life stage in a subbasin. Subbasin productivities are a weighted average. So each habitat type has a productivity, and those range from 0 to 1. There's no, you can't just keep adding them up. So we do a weighted average of those. So in this very simplified example, we have the fraction of the habitat capacity that's in small streams, the fraction in large rivers, and the fraction in floodplains. And these three values have to add up to 1. And so we multiply those by those respective capacity or productivities, whatever is in the small streams, the large rivers, and the floodplains, and that gives us the subbasin productivity for a life stage. So here's what some of the results look like. So these are for Coho, for Stillaguamish on the left and Snohomish on the right. And you can see that for both of them, the beaver ponds and the floodplain habitat are the largest restoration potential. So, and when we say restoration potential, what we're saying is what's the response of the population when you take that habitat from, in this case, historical beaver pond area or current beaver pond area to historical beaver pond area, how much response do you get in the spawner population? So that's what we're calling restoration potential. And so you can see that these two bars are the highest in both cases, followed by wood abundance. So those three are the ones that the model are suggesting have the most restoration potential. It's also fairly high for barriers with coho. Again, these are the ones that are in the smallest streams and have the most habitat affected by that. But again, remember that these were 20% and 22% above some kind of barrier, but because they're not all blocking, we don't get that full 20% response because some of that area is still used by a certain percentage of the fish that come back. So both basins had a 14% response to that. And then very little response to fine sediment, shade, or large river bank length and armor. So this is bank armor. When we say river bank, that just means bank armoring. So not much response from coho in either basin. Chinook salmon, a little bit different picture. So not nearly the same large response from floodplains and beaver ponds. In fact, they don't really use beaver ponds in the model. So there's not much response there at all. Mostly they're in the large rivers. So this large river bank riprap removal is what most of this response is. So if you could take out the riprap and restore it to some natural type of bank, you would get between 18 and 15% increase in the two basins. And then wood and floodplain habitat restoration do have an effect, as does shade. And this is mainly because of the effect on pre-spawn mortality. So in this model, we're running, because these fish come in so early in the fall, or it's still summer and still high temperature when they're coming into the system. So there's a function in the model that estimates a pre-spawn mortality due to the temperature. And so the model also, in addition to shade reducing temperature, reconnecting floodplains can also reduce temperature. So that's the main effect of these. The other effect of reconnecting floodplain habitat would be adding a little bit more spawning habitat. And then in the model, they do use side channels and other floodplain habitats as well. So that gives them a little bit of a benefit in both basins. The estuary or delta habitat, again, the delta in the Stillaguamish is quite small, so it doesn't really respond all that much. Whereas the delta in the Snohomish is pretty large and you get the biggest response from that. So that's what the Chinook look like. And then steelhead, again, a different response, mostly floodplain habitat and wood with a certain amount of response from shade and then pretty much nothing else. So one thing you see from the three of these is that, if you're trying to restore for all three species, you have to be kind of strategic about where and what you restore because it's not the same for everybody. So the prioritization is going to depend on either what species people want to focus on or how they want to quantify the multi-species benefit. So there are different ways of playing this game, which we didn't do in this particular project. But you can come up with ways to balance across the species, or you can focus on certain habitat areas. Like you can say, let's really focus on floodplain habitats and deltas because that's where we'll get the most benefit for all the species. In fact, the two that are fairly responsive for all three species are wood and floodplains. That tends to be a good thing to do for any of them. Finally, we did a sensitivity analysis. I'll spin through these pretty quickly because they're a little bit complicated, but also I want to leave some time for questions. So the main thing to see here is that the pink ones are capacities and the blue ones are productivities. A really steep line means you get a big response in spawners for a small change in that parameter. So this restoration benefit is how much restoration potential we have on the habitat side. So how much can we move, for example, winter rearing habitat from its current condition to its historical condition? That's what's the length of the line on the x-axis, and then the y is the response in the population if you as you move along that distance. So again, very responsive, but not much potential. So there's not a lot of room to move on this axis, whereas with the capacities, you can move quite a ways. And your biggest restoration potential in both basins is winter, followed by summer rearing habitat. So the rearing habitat is a big thing for coho. For Chinook salmon, it's a little bit different. This spring capacity is the one that splits the sub-yearlings from the yearlings. So this has a big effect because it determines how many can, I didn't mean yearlings, sub-yearlings from the fry. And so it has a big effect because it determines how many can stay as sub-yearlings, and they're the ones that have the higher survival. The ones that go out as fry, very few of those return. So it's really sensitive to this particular capacity because it determines that how many of that large higher survival group you get. And then pre-spawn so productivity is also an important parameter for them. And again, that's mostly a temperature effect. And then finally, steelhead, kind of the opposite. Pretty much all productivity. There's a lot of room to move on the y-axis for some of these in the capacity realm, but these are all rearing capacities and they don't have a lot of control on the steelhead population compared to the productivities. And then finally, one last thing, sensitivity to the delta productivity value. So this is just one example of how what you choose as a parameter in the model can make a really big difference in the outcome. And let's look at the Snohomish first. So this delta productivity is a really unknown parameter, and there are estimates of it ranging from like 3% to well over 60%. We ended up running it at 35%. We picked kind of a mid-range value. But this example illustrates how much difference it makes if you choose a different number. So when we run it at 35%, we get about, what is this, maybe a 35% increase in the population. Whereas if we ran it at 50%, we'd get twice as many fish in the response. If we ran it at 10%, we get almost nothing. So it's a really unknown parameter. And what that means is this would be a really good one to work to figure out how we can get more confidence in that number and figure out what it really should be. So this is just one example of some of the kinds of sensitivity analyses that we run. And again, because of the small delta in the Stillaguamish, you don't see as much response in the restoration. The one other thing to point out here is that what this does show is that if you can restore freshwater habitat alone, you get a certain benefit. If you restore delta alone, you get a certain benefit. If you restore them both, there's a synergy there that gets you a much bigger response. So, even if you can't get all the way to the end on these lines, which we won't, being able to do a little bit of both gets you a bigger response. So next steps, we need to revise the final report based on the partner reviews. We have the reviews back now. And I'm sure as we go through that, we'll find a few things that questions that get raised that make us want to go back and check the model, which we've been doing constantly anyway. And then for next year, we're going to have a phase 2 project in the Stillaguamish to evaluate more complex restoration scenarios, hopefully developed by partners and stakeholders, and then include climate change effects and hatchery effects in that model as well. So that's all I have. I ran a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I think we still have a little time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, we do have about 10 minutes still for questions, and we've gotten quite a few of them in the chat already. So we will just move through them as time allows. Feel free to continue to put your questions in the chat. If we can't get to them today, hopefully we can maybe follow up offline. And I've already kind of reached out to a few of you to let you know that those questions are something that we might want to do a little more digging before we can respond to. So the first question, Tim, is from Jessica. And so she asks, when talking about barriers, you're referring to barriers on existing streams. And does this account for overall filling, cutting off of streams habitat from historic conditions?
No, that particular data set, it starts with the WDFW barrier database, and then it's been, in this case, modified jointly by us and all of the partners, because there's a lot of updates that don't get made and a lot of corrections that need to be made in the locations of them. So it's a modified version of the WDFW barrier database. The only way channels get lost completely is if they are exist on an old map or in our reference data set, and then they don't exist today. So as I described for side channels, for example, a lot of those are that kind of situation. They're not blocked by a barrier, they're just not there anymore. But that shows up in the floodplain analysis and not in the barrier analysis.
Okay, thank you. Next question, do migration barriers include partial and complete barriers?
Yes, so those ratings that I showed, so in the WDFW database, each one gets a passage rating of 0, 0.33, 0.66, or 1 being fully passable, 0 being a block, and then the 0.33 and 0.66 are partially passable. It's not really clear what those numbers mean in terms of how fish can get through them. The way we model it is juveniles cannot move upstream through any barrier unless it's fully passable. And then adults can move upstream through anything that's not fully blocking, but only the percentage of them that survive is equal to that passage rating. So if the passage rating is 0.33, only a third of the adults are actually going to get past that. So we reduce the capacity above that barrier by 2/3 in that case.
Okay. Next question, regarding capacity change from loss of wood, what is baseline being compared against?
So depending on what you mean by baseline, so what we have is a current and a historical condition. Either one could be the baseline, but I'll just describe both. So the current condition, we basically assume that everything is low wood abundance, and we have lots of data on channels with low wood abundance. So we have estimates of, this one could take a while to answer. I'm going to answer for one piece of it because wood operates differently in all the different channel types, but I'll explain it for the small channels. So in the small channels, when there's low wood, there are less pools, and we have lots of data that tell us about what that should be, on average for each channel type and each land use cover class. So we can estimate what's out there by extrapolating the current data across that, stratified by channel type and by land cover class. And then when we go to the historical condition, we have a reference value. So we have fewer data, but we have sites where there's high wood abundance, and we use those to estimate what was there historically across the basin. So less certainty in those because we don't have a lot of sites left with high wood, but we're using two different field conditions, one with high wood and one with low wood. The low wood represents current and the high wood represents historical.
Okay, next question. It appears that temperature effects are local and not cumulative and are not associated with flow and doesn't include non-fish bearing reaches. Is this accurate? Should temperature be change in heat loading on fish bearing reaches?
Change in heat loading. So the way I'll work backwards from the fish. So what we have to link to fish is certain functions that relate, in our case, the 7-day average daily maximum to a survival value or a capacity value. So we create a multiplier from that. So if the temperature is lower than the minimum threshold, so for like coho, the multiplier will be 1 for everything less than 17 degrees, and then it declines up to 28 degrees, and then everything is 0 after that. So if you have any high temperature above 28, no fish will survive. That reduces productivity to 0 in those reaches. The other ones, if it's less than 17, all of those stay at their baseline productivity, and then there's a function that decreases it with temperature in between. So because we have the functions framed that way, that's the value that we're looking for from the temperature model. If you could do it more, there are other models out there that are trying to do this, where they look at temperature, daily temperature over a period of time, and food availability, and use that to estimate growth and survival. So I think that's what you're thinking of, maybe, is that there is a more complicated way to do it that's more realistic, but we don't have the data or the capacity to, sort of squeeze that into this model.
Okay, next question. How does sea level change predictions factor into future estuary area?
It does not right now. We have checked on that before, and with the climate impacts group at the University of Washington, and I haven't checked for a while. I should check with them again, but it's they say it's so uncertain, they're a little reluctant to use it for prediction purposes. And it's very different from one part of Puget Sound to another because of the isostatic rebound post ice age. So it's a little hard to say, but we do know that it's happening, and we know what it would affect. So if we can get a better, or maybe just an agreed upon estimate, what would people like to know? Like if they want to have us assume, what if it rises 1 foot or 2 feet? We can run different scenarios and see what difference that makes. But right now we're not doing anything with sea level rise. We do have climate change effects that we run on peak flow, low flow, and temperature, but not on sea level rise right now.
Okay. Let's see, we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So the next question is, what percent of the 2 basins would need to be treated with large woody debris to elicit a population response for Cohoed and Stillhead? They both ranked high for restoration potential.
We have not done that analysis. It could be done. The full restoration potential is an estimate of what the model functions would give you in terms of adult response if you restored everything. So the maximum would be, I think one of them was 23%. So if that brown bar says 23% increase, that's the most you could get. Depending on how you want to interpret that value, that's a significant response. It's definitely observable, but statistically, Phil Roney also did a paper a few years ago where he found that, in order to statistically detect a difference, you'd have to increase the population by at least 25%. So you'd have to do more than wood, most likely. You'd have to do wood plus some other things in order to get a response up to 25% so that you could detect it within the noise. And that's just because there's so much variability from year to year in the run size. If you do 10 years pre-restoration and 10 years after, the error bars around those estimates are very high. And so you have to get a big bump in order to statistically see the difference.
We're going to squeeze one last question in. What are your thoughts on using or not using peak flows as a parameter as it relates to eggs in the gravel?
We do use it. So it's in the model. We can run the model 2 ways. We can turn all the dynamics off and just run it deterministically. And in those cases, the peak flow is not in there. But we run it dynamically for the climate change analysis, and we can run it dynamically just for the current condition. And in that case, the peak flow varies from year to year, and so does the low flow, and so does the temperature, stream temperature. So the peak flow scours eggs in the gravel, and the relationship we use is from the Skagit Basin. We may, based on the comments, use a different one from the Stillaguamish Basin, but they're basically the same pattern. It's really, as return interval goes up, egg survival goes down. And they have the same shape. They're probably slightly different numbers, but we have local data that we can use. So that's how peak flow affects it. Low flow just affects it by either narrowing or widening the wetted width in the summer. So the amount of habitat, and then temperature obviously is just higher or lower in some years.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Tim. This has been wonderful. For everyone who's joined us today, we are really excited to see you all engaging with us. We're hoping to have quite a few more of these webinars in the near future. So we really are excited to highlight these really excellent projects and connect our stakeholders to these outcomes. For those who still have questions, I know we didn't get to everyone. Tim's contact information is here on this last slide. You can also reach out to our program if you have any questions about our NEP funding. And we just want to thank you again and hope to see you at our next webinar. Okay, bye everyone.
Thanks everyone.